and welcome to Silver Threads. This is our first show of 2021, and where we are still walking, still waking, and I'm Carla.
And I'm Eleanor, and this is the show where we trace our present path through the people and stories of the past, as we ourselves, long-term radicals, learn about each other, from each other, and continue to walk and continue to wake. And this week we're joined by Marina Sitrin, a mother, dreamer, and associate professor at Binghamton University, who writes about and participates in societies in movement, specifically looking at new forms of social organization, such as autogestión, horizontalidad, prefigurative politics, and new effective social relationships. She grounds much of her work in ethnography, oral history, and sociological narrative. She is the co-editor with Colectiva Sembrar of Pandemic Solidarity, Mutual Aid During the COVID-19 Crisis, author of Horizontalism, Voices of Popular Power in Argentina, Everyday Revolutions, Horizontalism and Autonomy in Argentina, the co-author of They Can't Represent Us, Reinventing Democracy from Greece to Occupy, and the forthcoming The New Revolutions from Social Movements to Societies in Movement. Thanks so much for being here, Marina.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks.
I also want to add that Marina is like the lighthouse in our community, like the lifeline for so many of us in these stormy days. And I just wanted to say it on here. I know I say it to you often, but I want to say it publicly and just thank you so much. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Now I'm starting with tears already, and we just started.
So we just get right to our questions. We kind of have a format because we're trying to amplify what it means to still walk, still wake, still learn, still show up, even when you've been doing stuff for a long time in radical spaces. And so the first thing we like to ask our guests is to kind of take us on a little bit of a historical journey. Perhaps if you have a watershed moment that ignited your involvement, particularly thinking like your involvement collectively.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a wonderful question. Sometimes I think we become aware or involved in ways that we hadn't realized because we define being involved in certain ways. And so for me, it started really young. Not the big organizations or networks or things like that, but I come from an interracial family. So I have a number of siblings from different backgrounds. And it was around race when I was younger. I idolized my older sister, still do in a lot of ways. And her father had been in the Black Power movement. And so she's interracial. And it didn't even occur to me, I think, for a period of time, kind of race. And so somewhere around middle school, early middle school, she was being treated really differently and people were saying awful things. And it was one of those moments where I became aware that they were saying it because she's Black. And so it was a shift. I grew up in a radical family. You know, my parents were both involved in movements and continue to be in different ways. And so I was aware in an abstract way, but it was that moment where it became so clear and personal. And so I started to get involved in unlearning racism kinds of workshops in middle school with different groups. And then that quickly kind of turned into the anti-apartheid movement into high school. So it was kind of the beginning to be engaged. And I very quickly was dissatisfied with movements and groups and felt that it was the whole system. You know, I was this teenage anti-capitalist. We have to get rid of capitalism. And I met some socialist groups and so decided that that was the way to go. I read the Communist Manifesto and joined the Young Socialist Alliance and was a Trotskyist and a militant, you know, we will get rid of capitalism. We will just build the party, the 12 of us or 50 of us or whatever. So that was, I mean, it was, and we can talk about this later because it was influential, it continued to be influential for me into my 20s and even today in some of my thinking, but more critically. So that was a big moment. And then I was critical over the years of these different, I was in and out of a number of different socialist groups, kind of struggling to, we have to get rid of capitalism, but there were so many problems with these groups, especially hierarchy and a lack of democracy and participation, and this view with the party being a vanguard. I had critiques of all of it. And I had met some anarchists, and it didn't feel right to me. It was very identity feeling, the people that I had met. And I didn't feel welcome in those spaces for different reasons. So then when I was in law school in the late 90s, 1999, actually was my third year of law school, and I was part of this women's clinic. And I went to Seattle, actually as a part of the group Madre, a women's kind of human rights advocacy group. And at a certain point, some of the conversations, and I went there also because I was interested. I knew there was going to be a big demonstration. I just had no idea how it was being organized. And it wasn't until I was there. And that was a watershed moment for me, that you can be anti-capitalist, you can have a different vision of society, and it doesn't have to be awful. It doesn't have to be, about punishment and guilt and hierarchy. It can be beautiful and joyous and super militant, and to take a page out of your book, quite literally, Carla. So that the experience in Seattle, I didn't work and do anything with the NGO. I was out on the street doing direct action and blockades, and also then met people who were doing the direct action kind of legal support and jail solidarity. And that also opened my mind as to what was possible with kind of law. So then I got involved in the direct action network. And so it's a long kind of biography. Those are some of the most kind of personally significant moments. Maybe later we'll talk a bit about Argentina and some of my experience there, because that was a whole different world. That wasn't, an experience of people intentionally organizing in assemblies to shut something down, but an entire society self-organized, which is a different kind of phenomenon.
I mean, I feel like we can jump right into that because I'm super curious, and I think that follows the biographical wave.
Totally. Okay, great. No, it does. And it's kind of chronologically, 1999 is Seattle and the Direct Action Network, and I was involved in the different direct action, direct democracy kind of networks. And then in 2001, I was living in New York City. So there was the September 11th in New York City, 2001. And that shut down a lot of space, or at least we felt like space was being shut down. I think there was kind of both things happening as far as the kind of direct action and direct democracy projects we were involved in. And by chance, I ended up meeting some people. I'd heard about what was happening in Argentina. So that's the 19th and 20th of December in 2001. There was a popular rebellion, kind of this beginning of society coming out together in the streets. And it was in response to an economic crisis, but it was much more than that. It was an economic crisis. It was a political crisis. It was a history of dictatorship not being discussed. There were so many things that came together. And so I had met some people at the World Social Forum in Brazil. The World Social Forums then had these really big autonomous spaces that were self-organized from people around the world. And I met people from Argentina. And one woman, Paula, said, "Oh yeah, just come to stay in my apartment. I stay with my boyfriend all the time. You can just come." And I took her seriously, and I packed a big suitcase and arrived. And culturally, it's a lovely culture. And it's one of these like, "Oh yes, come." But I'm not sure that she actually, we're very good friends. And she jokes that she didn't really totally expect that I was going to show up with a suitcase at her doorstep. Like, okay, I'm here. And that, being in Argentina in those moments of mass assemblies and people taking over workplaces and unemployed taking over land and indigenous getting reinvigorated and networking with all of the different movements from different backgrounds was, well, and still is, I think, an incredibly significant moment in our kind of collective history of what's possible in autonomous organizing. So that shifted things for me as far as scale and self-organization. And I think it should for all of us. But it's amazing when we organize things like shutting down the World Trade Organization and use mass assemblies and forms of direct democracy. It's a whole other thing when an entire society is organizing in assemblies with forms of direct democracy without saying first, okay, let's come together and use direct democracy because representation doesn't really work. But that it was this organic, that idea of horizontalidad, kind of really took root and spread throughout society. And it's a word that hadn't been used before in Spanish. And people used it as a way to describe this relationship of direct democracy, for lack of as a kind of shorthand, but it's way more than direct democracy. It's creating new relationships in this dynamic with one another and in creating concrete projects. So meeting needs, it was a terrible economic crisis, and taking over workplaces and using the same form and land and creating not just micro projects, but big projects to sustain large communities. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands to millions of people involved in this, a barter network of almost 7 million people. Tremendous kind of possibility in transforming society.
Yeah, Marina, when I first heard about horizontalism, because similarly to you, I really didn't like identifying as an anarchist or really felt like I belonged in anarchism. And when I was on the board of Institute for Anarchist Society, my friends were like, it's out, the cat's out of the bag. It's too late. But anyways, flipping back a bit, horizontalism really, that's what it felt, that kind of, I could get behind that. And a lot of the writing that I was coming up against was men, a lot of men talking about horizontalism. And when I found you and your work, I just, because I think you make that connection about social relationships in a way that a lot of the work I was reading didn't do. It was still through a bit of a lens of whether it's socialism or something. There was something more about like keeping it more about the systemic, ending class and stuff. And I'm wondering, it seems to maybe connect back to that being politicized with that relationship with your sister. And maybe you can talk a bit how that sits in your work and how it continues to grow. And
so that, thank you. I'm so glad. Though it's kind of disingenuous to call it my work. It's not, it's my work in that it's I'm dedicated to facilitating the voices of other people. So I went back and forth with horizontalism as, an edited book, and it's authored because it's my lens, but it's all interviews with people over the course of years, long hours and hours, kind of interviews that then I edit down, which anyone who's listening, who's ever had hours and hours of interviews that then you need to edit down. And then it's hundreds of people and you need to put it in a book, not, a set of encyclopedic volumes or something. It's really hard, and it was so hard. So it's facilitating, it's what I saw and heard, and that's what I did. And I think our listening, that if we listen more, we see this more, we hear this more. People talk about, in these more kind of transformative autonomous spaces in particular, they talk about their relationships with one another. And in the opposite, when people leave these political groups that call themselves parties and things like that, it's often because of bad social relationships that's not addressed because it's not seen as political or serious. But that is so much of the heart of all of this. And this is what everyone was saying. And I think that's why this horizontalidad is not my theory or invention at all. It's what people were doing and how they were describing what they were doing. And it's why in the book, people from all different parts of the country, from all different backgrounds, from unemployed, kind of permanently unemployed as a state of being, to formal middle class, were all organizing and talking about this same kind of relationship being core in what they were doing. So that, I think when we start with theory, and that's often what men are taught to do, or maybe what we're taught to do in society, and women more often don't. But also kind of people who are practicing now, kind of thinking about social movements and participating, it's not just a male-female. I think it's also about where you're situated in the world, class, geography. So in Latin America, people are talking much more about social relationships in the movements. So it might be in certain parts of Europe or certain parts of what is called the United States or Canada. People kind of start with theory. And so then let's fit this into this theory that I have. And that's deeply problematic. I'm not also saying that whatever movements are doing, like, oh, yay, great, let's just, capture that and put it on paper, and that's what we should do. But we have to listen first. So yeah, I guess I see myself as a facilitator. I love facilitating assemblies and meetings, and I kind of do that in writing. And so I happen to be in a university because it's a much better job than doing law or other things. And it's security for my child and I love teaching, but it's not because I have some academic aspirations and like, you should know my name. I really, no, it's about other people's voices. And so if we can use our positions to facilitate other people's voices, then that's great.
Yeah. Speaking to solidarity in on every level. Yeah. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. And I also think it's really cool that there are several professors that I know of that are these radical human beings and have chosen to be professors for that same reason, and also because as one of my friends says, he's like, I wanted to be insidious and be the anarchist that's teaching your kids as opposed to the right-wing nutbag. But I also wanted to kind of pinpoint out, like on one of the questions, specifically with regards to your place, like your geographical place, because from what I've heard, I've unfortunately never been to Argentina, but I'd love to go. I feel like, and this is true for a lot of places in Latin America, but there is this like deeper cultural understanding of imperialism and capitalism, and not to mention, Argentina has the coup to look back on that wasn't that long ago, the U.S. backed coup, as opposed to the U.S. where there's really more so, I guess, like in my generation and older, a lack of understanding of capitalism and imperialism. I think younger folks have a better, or they're getting a better understanding at a way earlier age than I did. But I'm curious, like in terms of radicalism, like what it means to you, having experienced both like the American version or the American events and watershed moments, and then being a part of this moment and movement in Argentina, and how that looks differently, both like on a surface level, but also like deeper on a deeper cultural level as well.
Yeah. It's different, and it's not that different. I mean, it's different for all the reasons you're saying, as far as histories and understanding, kind of an intellectual understanding, but also an embodied understanding. I mean, of course you understand imperialism because that's the system that overthrew the government that killed your grandparents. There's that kind of direct lineage that you can't break. And so there's that. But at the same time, I guess I fear saying too much cultural difference, depending where we're talking about. And so there's power and power imbalance all over the world and within each of our different societies. And so I try to think more about where we have the points of meeting and intersection and possibility, without making it, clearly I was coming from this imperialist country going to Argentina as well. There wasn't like, okay, I'm one of you and we're in the same place, let's go with the unemployed movement or things like that. And that's really important, I think, for all of us doing different kinds of organizing work, whatever that community is that we're getting involved in, if it's different from our background, kind of knowing where we are. But, and maybe this isn't really what you're asking, but it's something that occurred to me because when I was younger, I used to feel guilty. I have this privilege. I come from this horrible imperialist country, and no matter how much of an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist I am, still kind of carrying that weight with me. And it was people, not in Argentina, it was actually earlier, I think in Nicaragua, who said in a really gentle, loving way, get over it. Like, you need to just be in the struggle with us and lose your guilt. It's not helpful. And it's about you. They didn't say it like that at all. But that was my takeaway. It was like, oh, wow, this is really my holding all of this. And it becomes an obstacle in creating relationships. Yeah. And I've done work. I mean, it's Argentina, but I've spent a lot of time in different places around the world. So in Bolivia or Mexico, Nicaragua was a long time ago, but also in different parts of Europe. So Greece and Spain, parts of Southern Europe that are just not the same as, when I lived in Berlin for a while, just very different kind of political situation and historical situation. And Yeah, I think it's more about trying to make connections with people and across geographies as much as we can. So that's, I guess, personally, politically, I've been thinking about this as it's been a few years. I'm living in, near Binghamton, New York. So one of these many kind of post small industry towns and cities that becomes more of a jail town. And so being involved in things like anti-prison work and the local mutual aid networks, but also continuing to try and use the different relationships with people around the world to help people meet one another. And I think the more we can do that, the better. So it's both important to be super locally situated and not to forget all those other connections we have from different places. Because if we can be conduits, that's one of the things I think we're missing the most right now.
Yeah. I was just thinking about listeners, and can you talk a little bit, maybe explain or what horizontalism is? I think what I liked about it was that it's a lot of times with collectivism, particularly in anarchism, there's this like desire to be flat, right? Completely flat. And that's where the problems happen. That's like ignoring power, ignoring the natural authorities that are in the room. The verticalism, I think, is another way to talk about that connection outside of the horizontal community. Is there a way that maybe you could, I don't know. I know it's a complex notion, but I know that if I was listening to this, I'd be like, somebody tell me what it is.
No, I think that's great. And I actually think it's really important because having participated in Occupy Wall Street in New York and visiting, spending time with people in other parts of the world afterward, some people have started to use the language of horizontalism as if it's a thing, like I'm more horizontal than you almost. I mean, I'm joking and I'm not joking. Like it really is like we are the most horizontal. And from the use in Argentina and my sense of the word, it's a relationship. And actually Emilio, who also became a very good friend, who continues, he was organizing way back. So it's when he's interviewed in the book, he's 17. He now has been living in the north, coordinating and working with the Guarani communities in defense of the land. And Emilio said at 17 years old that horizontalism is a tool and a goal. And it's a tool and a goal that when you started talking, you were talking about the walk. And it's this tool and a goal toward freedom as a part of a walk and a relationship. And you don't become horizontal. You don't become horizontalidad. It's a alidad. It's not a thing. It's a relationship. And so it's about creating relationships that create more space for people to participate. That implies a more of a power with one another. But also, and this isn't to say it was done perfectly in assemblies and in workplaces, not at all. People were and continue to be very self-reflective about how this worked, particularly around the question of leadership, that certain people we play different roles and have different skill sets, and recognizing that. And in recognizing that and talking about it, then that's still a part of this horizontalidad, because someone can speak really well or give big speeches and someone else happens to have a law degree so they can help negotiate what happens when the police come. It's not to give them special power, but it's to recognize they have specific maybe knowledge. So someone with medical training might have a specific knowledge, but someone coming from an indigenous community has a very different concept of health that they're bringing in to think in a totality. So seeing all of these different pieces as different, and yet one is not above the other. Implied also in horizontalidad was affect. It was something that I heard first in Argentina and was like, what? Política afectiva? What do you mean, like effective, like with an A, politics? Like what? And I've since, looked it up, and over the years, it can be like this heavy theory that some people talk about in linguistics. And I don't even understand some of the things people write about it, quite honestly. And the way people were talking about it in Argentina was just like, it's about care. It's about love. It's that in these relationships, we care for one another. And that develops as part of the relationship. And then the relationship changes, but the care is there, and then the kind of care changes. And so it's this whole dynamic in an ever-changing relationships. The idea that someone could be more horizontal doesn't even make sense because it has to be like a live thing that's occurring. And unfortunately, I think we missed some of that, and not missed like it's a permanence, but things that we have to learn more is to keep it as an ongoing kind of relationship. And then also autonomy. And that was also something people in Argentina talked about in a, not like autonomous Marxism as much as Negri and all kinds of people are like, great, like read that, that's fine, that's good. But just more like when you hear the word autonomy, what do you think? I mean, my 7-year-old talks about my autonomy, sometimes to a point where I'm like, no, but your autonomy and you still have to go to sleep. But that sense of, your relationship to power, I guess with my child, I'm the power. But that we are autonomous kind of from, and we're doing this together with one another. So it implies a lot, and it's not like a theory that like, okay, let's take it and do it. It's about practices and thinking together about the kinds of relationships we want to have in our groups or networks or movements, and then and doing it. I mean, I think a lesson to be learned, not that it's like wrong or something like that, but just as we walk, we learn these different things. I think we do need more agreements. I mean, rules even, if you will, like if you're okay with the word rules, but we have to commit to certain kinds of agreements. So what happens when we say we're going to have this kind of relationship, and then people step out because we're all kinds of messed up by capitalism and sexism, racism, like all this stuff, we're all going to mess up all the time. And what do we do? And how do we keep a relationship that's based in care and that's horizontal when we mess up? I think just calling someone out on it is actually not going to do that. And it doesn't do it in a care-based way. So how can we make sure these things are dealt with collectively? And that was one of the challenges people faced in Argentina. And I think something we could learn and are learning in a lot of spaces, but how we have horizontalidad with a kind of alternative way of thinking about healing with harms. But people should read the voices of people from Argentina for horizontalidad. And as people reflected on it in so many other spaces around the world in different ways, whether with the same language or not. The Plataforma in Spain, the land, the kind of housing, the anti-eviction housing defense movement that started before 2011, but really took off kind of with the movement of the squares. They start all of their assemblies. It's about people coming together and talking first, just checking in and telling their stories. Where are you? Who are you? And that creates a care with one another. And from that care, and this is something that workers told me in recuperated workplaces also in Argentina, like that care, that love, and these were like dudes in Argentina telling me about love. And I was kind of like, wow, really? That also, then people are going to step up for each other. And that means like levels of militancy. So when the police come to evict that workplace, or when it's time, in Spain that someone's home might get evicted, there's a relationship that's not just ideologically or politically you believe someone shouldn't be evicted, but you've grown to really care about all of these people in this room and their homes. And so we know from our personal relationships, going back to me and my sister, I guess, that, you're really willing to put your body on the line when someone you care about is being threatened. And so it, love makes us more militant. Thank you, Carla. I know that's your book again.
I think that is you too. I mean, we interviewed you for our book and you made that connection and that's why I interviewed you, because you made that connection between relationship and like an increase of care and trust in our relationships builds an increase. The outcome is an increase in militancy. And that's something you said before we even wrote our book. So thank you.
I guess that's mutualism right there. Yeah, no, I was thinking of the Fred Hampton quote when you were talking about, theory, that I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's like theory's nice, but without practice, it ain't shit. And I always loved that quote because it was just so succinct. Like, yeah, it's great if you want to sit and like, I'm a total theory nerd, but when we're doing like a community garden or when we're stopping ICE from deporting a neighbor, we're not really talking about Kropotkin in that moment. We're busy doing other shit. And it's also a way to bring people in, because people aren't going to be engaged if you're like, hey, can I talk to you about Kropotkin? They're going to be engaged if you're like, hey, do you want some kale? Right. But yeah, so I was also curious because you talked about like making those connections earlier. I imagine like in the past, there are hurdles that I feel like like COVID might have plateaued a little bit because we're all dealing with the same disaster kind of all at once. So I'm curious how COVID has shifted or changed your work, if it has.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, not being able to be out face to face with people for sure changes things, from direct organizing to kind of helping to facilitate voices. It's much harder on Zoom. So it's changed. It's different things. It's something I'm thinking about a lot. It's a good question. I don't have an answer exactly because I'm not sure I've reflected on it enough. I feel like I kind of go back and forth with my understanding of where I am, even with all of this. I spend a lot more time talking to people about how they're doing, helping to adjudicate conflict. So outside police and state and laws and things like that, there are a lot of conflicts that come up, harms, and helping people to try to resolve those. So doing that a lot on Zoom. And it feels like that's been a shift, and where a lot of my focus has gone over this last, year plus. And listening to people who are having a really hard time, which I think we have to do with each other a lot more. And yeah, it is a horrible time and a really inspiring time. I think to say, and it's totally true, it's laid bare again what capitalism is and what it's about, and the values, and it's not about life and caring for people and what are our priorities in society. In the United States, it's like keep the restaurants open and not help people have access to homes. I mean, it's all kinds of crazy. And I don't know, because it's laid bare again, like happens in crisis, does that mean, we're going to kind of step in and meet that challenge now? And that's the part that honestly is what I'm struggling with most. That's about me personally, and that's about us collectively. And it's an incredibly horrible time and an incredibly inspiring time with the numbers of people around the world. This is what we did with our project in Pandemic Solidarity, was to try to just take some snapshots, quick, of things that are happening around the world. And there's so much care, so much mutual aid, so much solidarity everywhere, in neighborhoods, in big scale, or at least medium scale. And early on, in the first, many months, I thought that was going to scale over more, so that networks would begin to coordinate with more networks, both regionally, globally. Of course, it made sense, similar to kind of what happened in Argentina, where there'd been more divisions, say, with certain groups in the past, or tensions, and that people started to work together more. And I know that's happening in a lot of places, but not to the level that I think we were all hoping it would. And it's not like the opportunity still isn't there. Of course it's still there. But I wonder about why. Like, I wonder, are we afraid of our own capacity for power? And I know a lot of people have said that. I wonder why more of us aren't talking to more of us, especially because we're at home, like those of us who are self-organized. Because organizing locally in this horizontal way with mutual aid, we do fairly naturally in a time of crisis. And then we call it something political more recently, and that's great. Like, call it mutual aid, and it's quite radical and revolutionary when we talk about it and what we're practicing. And so why isn't that scaling over more. What's happening there? And I don't know, what do you think? Like, why are we afraid of ourselves? Like, are we, I don't know. I mean, that sounds too awful to say like we're afraid of that kind of power, but there's a block and I don't understand that. I'd like to dig more into that and talk to more people and figure out why do you think that's happening?
That's such a good question. I mean, right away, I have to point to empire. I mean, we're so bloody subjugated. Even those of us who are excited about the possibility of ending capitalism and the immense responsibility of creating a new world. It's huge, right? So that I think even those of us who are like up for that challenge to sit in the fire, as one author called it, I can't remember who said that, but sit in the fire together. But I think like, we were really subjugated. I think empire is part of the problem. And maybe that's too abstract, but I mean, just surviving capitalism. Like my partner is working class, like he works 40 hours a week. Like, so that just takes up most of our time. So that's just my personal story. And you just amplify that. I think that would be my first response, but I'm definitely going to sit with it longer. And I think it's a great conversation to be having publicly.
We've had that conversation in a couple of spaces that I'm a part of, and the answers are pretty varied. I think a friend of mine who grew up in India occupied Kashmir said that the Americans think that they have something left to lose, and so they're clinging to that idea. So I think that there's some of that. I also think that from what I've talked to folks in our community, they're like, well, we're not ready yet. We don't even have shit on lock so that we can take care of our own community. Like, people are drowning in the need. And the need, like, we thought it was going to like ebb by this time, and it just keeps going. Like, the need just keeps skyrocketing. So that's also one of the things that I've heard. And I mean, I've sat with it too, and like my own fears of my own aspirations. And I think it's a complex question. And I think depending on the day, I'll have a different answer for you.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it's good in that it's helpful, and hopefully more people think about it. And maybe it's also just, I mean, for me personally, my impatience, like that I was a Trotskyist a long time, like Trotskyist and that anarchist impulse, just like smash the state and be done with this, and what do we do about prisons and alternatives? The little micro stuff I've been doing personally, and I know people who are involved in, as far as trying to work on harm and circle justice and things like that. I think we definitely need a lot more of that in place. Not, political party program, that kind of in place. We need more practice maybe in some of the healing practices, so that when these bumps come up as we're scaling over, we're able to, as best we can anyway, begin to deal with that. Because it seems like that's been one of the big, big challenges in so many groups and movements. People often refer to it as interpersonal, but it's much more than interpersonal. It's about power and gender and race and these pieces of capitalism that we need to talk more about. That create these divisions, and then we have to stop the misbehavior.
I think like that's another thing that I've heard is like the vacuum that, when everything goes to shit, people tend to lean back on their programming. And unfortunately, our programming is largely to rebuild something shitty and hierarchical and not just. And so I think people are also worried about that vacuum. And in particular, for something like the United States, with the largest military the world has ever seen, I think there's a very big fear that it's going to be like, it's going to be like one large massacre.
You're listening to Silver Threads, part of the Grounded Futures multimedia platform. For more information and to donate to our totally ad-free show, check out groundedfutures.com. You can reach out to us with thoughts and suggestions at silverthreadshow@protonmail.com. You can find out more about our host Eleanor via artkillingapathy.com and our host Carla via joyfulthreadsproductions.com. And now, back to the show.
I think sometimes we avoid these conversations because they seem so impossible to even get your head around. And I think, like, speaking about prefiguration or building or creating these newer collectively or horizontally run, I guess, for lack of a better word, kind of institutions is necessary because, like, they need to be on the horizon for people to see that it can be done. And, I think about in Greece and the medical clinics. I was talking to a friend yesterday who's a paramedic and doing more studying because he's like, the back end of 911 is just like it could, and thinking about building new worlds and being there for people in that way, like that, even that like needs some real prefiguration thinking. Anyway, you could probably talk more about the Greece thing because I know you spent time there, but I'm curious to maybe swing back to our questions about this kind of laying bare time of capitalism and people being just more aware of how terrible empire is, whether it's racism or patriarchy or capitalism. Like, do you have more hope now with this?
So I do as well. Yeah, I know that's going to be crazy. It's like I've spent more time talking to people who are sad and having a really hard time. I mean, it's people we love are dying, whether it's because of COVID or because of COVID, but COVID isn't on the piece of paper. So there's that horror, and I do have more hope. I do think it's more possible. If we had this conversation a little over a year ago, my concern might not have been how seriously are we taking the question of scaling over our mutual aid projects, our self-organization, and our not meaning self-identified political groupings, people organizing in society. That, what I saw in Argentina, what people experienced of society, the idea of societies in movement themselves, that's something we're experiencing around the world, which is huge. And it's something that I think most of us would agree, like, of course, that's what happens when there's a, earthquake or a flood. People come together, we help one another. But we have that mass crisis, and there's that mass level of helping. So I am much, much, much more hopeful now, for sure. And I'm thinking more about the questions of, so what does that look like? It's not a transitional program. It's not, there's like the party line. And so thinking about what organizations are inspiring now. And of course, all of these mutual aid groups everywhere, just anywhere you look, there are groups, people who are listening. If you don't know them, put in the name of your county or your province and put in the word mutual aid or solidarity or care or COVID help or something. Non-institutional, for sure, will come up. Lots of things will come up. There's so many ways to participate. So that's incredible. And so I was thinking about all of these groups obviously are really inspiring. And then there's a network. And I love a lot of the people in it. So what I'm about to say might come off a little strange. So kind of started with a handful of people in the US, Symbiosis, which is a grouping of people who have come together to try to create a network kind of scaling outward, kind of based in North America, more US, Mexico, of projects that are and networks and groups that are based in this idea of horizontalidad, even if they don't say that, but it's kind of direct democracy, autonomy, self-organization. And it's not to say that Symbiosis is perfect. I wouldn't say like, okay, everyone go join Symbiosis. That would be fine and great if people did become a part of that network. But it's an attempt to create a confederation. It's an attempt to link all of these different networks. And so that is really exciting and important, whether it is Symbiosis itself or it's other kinds of projects like this, because it's thinking in that okay, what does society look like as a whole? How do we continue to move outward? I keep saying outward because, the Zapatistas early on had that phrase about from below into the left, where the heart resides. So it's like that out. It's not up. It's not, it's just out. For sure. Hope and finding it all around us.
I'm also curious because one of the kind of points of this podcast is to share vulnerabilities and to also share the simple fact that the idea of like purism, or as Carla puts it in her book, rigid radicalism, or like you said, I'm more horizontal than you, like that's bullshit, and that folks are still learning, as even if they've been doing this a really long time. So I'm curious for you, how do you feel that you're still learning, and how do you feel that your journey has shifted, and what does the future look like in terms of your journey, do you feel?
Oh, I make mistakes all the time. It's so important to say that we do. Some of them are harder to say out loud than others. The easier ones to talk about are the ones that were further away. When I was in like an aspiring political party and dropped out of college to work in a garment factory. And I was like, I was going to recruit the workers in this garment factory. And I think of myself now then, and all the workers would buy my newspaper. Like, why would they buy my newspaper? They would have bought pie that I brought in. It was like an act of solidarity. And so there's certain things I've done that I definitely look back and like that are big. And a lot of them are related to more lecturing type politics. I have the truth. I'm bringing it to you in this whatever way, whether that's, a Trotskyist group, which is easier to pick on, but it could also be, here's my horizontal plan. This is how we're going to create this new care-based relationship in our organizing, and maybe people not feeling that. So listening more, not kind of going in with the idea of, even not that it's like the perfect theory, but just going in to whatever situation listening. And I try hard to do that, and I mess up a lot. Are more bumps that I have. So this is like a very recent confession. I don't know if confession is the right word, but there was a group I didn't get involved in locally for a while because I knew that one of the people who was core in organizing it had been saying things about me. Basically that I'm like not theoretical enough because I, facilitate people's voices and whatever. It's like kind of an academic-y critique that I know is nonsense. And if I heard it of anyone else, I would say, well, but movements are creating their theory. And so, what do you think theory is? Where does theory come from? And yet being on the receiving end of that critique made me take an extraordinary long time to begin to participate in that group. So the kind of lessons of recognizing our own vulnerabilities in all of this, and that's okay. I should have gotten involved earlier, but I didn't. I reached out to the person. We had a really good conversation. It's like all good now. And that sometimes people maybe are uncomfortable with that. Maybe you have someone else help you reach out to that person. But so, yeah, trying to be more self-aware of kind of our position, who we are, listening more. And if something is like an ouch, finding a way to tell somebody and talk about it, because these ouches actually, I'm 50 years old. I've been organizing since I was like 10, that I could feel awkward means I imagine that most people have had these experiences, where you just feel like, oh, this doesn't feel right because whatever, or you imagine someone thinks something. So the personal is political. So these things are all like, we just take it up together. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking, but it's what occurred to me.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I worked in recording studios when I lived in LA for 10 years. And one of the things my mentor said was, if you're going to fuck up loudly. And then we'll deal with it. Don't try to be shy and fuck up loudly. So, yeah.
That's great. Yeah, no, it's totally true. And it's sometimes surprising the things that we don't want to share, and they're actually getting in the way of our ability to fully participate, or other people's. And yeah.
My youngest, he had a speech impediment like me, and he would often say things wrong and stuff, and his friends would always correct him. And he looked, when he was 5, he said, "Everything I do wrong is wonderful." And I've just always been like, that's going to be my mantra. Every time I make a mistake, it's fabulous.
That's great. I love that. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. I'm curious about, like, you I mean, you already spoke to you're seeing what was happening with your sister, and the racism and stuff, but is there kind of like a guidepost person, or a collective, or a book, or something that has kind of been this touchstone thing that you refer to, that has guided you or sparked you?
Early on, like when I was younger, I grew up with my parents listening to folk music a lot, mostly US folk music. So it was at first Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie. And now it's amazing. I think about, I'll sometimes play music and my child will ask about the words. And I think, wow, I grew up with some pretty hardcore lyrics, like about songs about lynchings and, really horrible Hiroshima, Nagasaki, like big stuff. So music played a big role when I was much younger. Not so much books. I had to read a whole bunch of books in these different socialist groups, but no, it was music and relationships. Later, so like now even, is that kind of the question? Sure. One of the books I go back to all the time is Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark. And it's, Rebecca, if you're listening, I love you. We love you.
We love you, Rebecca.
We love you. And you don't have to read the whole book, like every single page. It's like, there's just pages within it that remind us that we don't know the effects of what we do later. So that we're organizing now. And we don't know, we sometimes feel like we failed, or we don't know what the impact was. And in the little book, she asks the question, well, she kind of flips it. And so, well, what if we hadn't? What if we hadn't organized then what would things have looked like? If we hadn't organized around the Iraq War, how much worse might it have been? And we don't know, when we're creating these relationships with one another, how and what they'll turn into later, or how they'll spiral outwards. So it's a wonderful reminder of that things aren't so linear. And she talks about history being like a crab and how it scuttles. And so that's a beautiful one for me. And then literature, more than, I guess, like the big theory. I love a lot of the Latin American, more public intellectuals than people housed in universities. So like Raúl Zibeci and Raquel Gutierrez and people I would highly recommend as far as thinking about societies and movement. But for the imagination is what it is for me. It's about, those books that help us think. And I don't just mean imagination, new society. So like Ursula Le Guin, of course, and Starhawks, The Fifth Sacred Thing, that whole series, I've read them an absurd number of times because they allow you to imagine that different world in fiction. So it just, for me, it just allows my imagination to open further. I don't come to that like, well, how is that possible? And how is that going to work? Like all of that has to be put on hold because you're reading something that's a novel. And then I just love literature for fun, magic realism, and certain books that just free my mind more. So I would suggest that is finding your, like, what thing, music, words help to let your imagination flow more into the possible and the impossible. Isn't that in Alice in Wonderland? Imagine one impossible thing every day.
Yeah. Love that. Yeah. Fiction over here too. And Rebecca's book. It was a main book for Joyful Militancy.
So part of that question too, in terms of inspiration, I mean, you've mentioned a few people that have inspired you. Kind of wanted to circle back to that. Like, is there an organizer or a radical or a thinker or even a collective that has inspired you like in a really powerful way to act or to jump into something that that turned out to be like a watershed moment in your life or something like that?
There are a lot of people that people wouldn't know the names of that I met in Argentina who had that impact on me. Some people would know them. Claudia Cunha from La Vaca and Mu. People know her name much more now. As far as guiding people, kind of mentors for me that I'm so grateful for. And like so many people, probably the Zapatistas as Marcos translated much of that experience in the later 90s was huge for me because it's kind of like where literature meets theory and practice, but it's all real. And as far as organizations and things like that, I don't know. In Seattle, had it not been for the people doing jail solidarity and Katya Komisarek in particular, and the work that she was helping to spearhead with jail solidarity, I don't know. So what I ended up doing is not practicing law, but doing activist legal work. So continuing to be in movements and doing kind of sometimes liaisoning with lawyers and things like that and movements. And by not being admitted to the bar, it allows one to speak with a kind of authority, but at the same time, you don't have to risk losing your bar card. So you could talk about like, oh, if you were to do this, this might be the consequence or not. And so I did that for a few years. And that, I think, just personally was part of determining my path. Had I not seen that possibility, I might have ended up doing human rights law or something for a while, which, still being an organizer and a militant without a doubt. But, I wonder, like all of these people who touch us in our lives, that would be a fun thing to do. Maybe it's like a New Year's experiment. Kind of list all the people who, without whom, what might have happened.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Connected to that, and I think you'll appreciate this question because you're a facilitator of amplifying voices and stories. We like to also ask our guests if there's a newer activist or organizer or collective that maybe has come about in the last year or two that is inspiring you, that you want to amplify and share some solidarity for.
There are a bunch of young organizers around Binghamton and Vestal and this area, very locally post-industrial, upstate New York, and people who've been doing so much amazing work from the decarceration projects together with people. The group is called Decarcerate. And that's been in existence for a while. And then there's now a mutual aid group and a radical cooperative bookstore that if anyone can't afford books, they give away the books. And it's really nice. So the folks putting all of that together, like in my immediate area. Yeah.
That's lovely.
Yeah, I love that. It reminds me of little, in DC, there are these little like book cubbies. Like they look like birdhouses. I guess it's not just in DC. I guess it's in a lot of places. But yeah, because there's oftentimes like a lot of crap, like those like crappy romance novels from like the 90s where there's like some like half-dressed woman and then like some guy, some Fabio dude. And so what I do is I take those out and then I put a copy of your book, Carla, in there, and then I put a copy of Scott's book in there, and I was just like, here you go. Here's some better shit.
I love that.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's definitely. And there are people who, if you have access to a university, there are many publishers who will give you a book if you're considering using it for a class, for example, for the cost of shipping.
Wow.
So lots of faculty contribute to this bookstore now.
Mm-hmm. That's neat. We early on in the pandemic, we have those boxes too. I went around and put toilet paper in all of them and some food because, there was just a lot of and misplaced fear, but there was fear around that. So books matter, and, so does toilet paper.
Silver Threads is recorded in different places across borders. Carla is located in Canada on Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. Eleanor is located here and there, usually either in Sweden or on Piscataway land, now known as Washington, D.C. And our guests join us from around the world. You can find out more about the show and our guests at groundedfutures.com. To learn more about Eleanor's work, visit artkillingapathy.com and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at activisteleanor. For Carla, follow her on Twitter and Instagram at joyfulcarla. You can also reach out to us at silverthreadsshow@protonmail.com. And lastly, if you want to support the making of the show, you can donate over at groundedfutures.com. Thank you to the Grounded Futures team for supporting us with promotion. All of the snazzy graphics that you see are created by Jamie Lee Gonzalez. Grounded Futures is a multimedia platform and is produced by Carla Bergman, Jamie Lee Gonzalez, and Melissa Roach. Post-production audio for our show is done by Eleanor Goldfield. The intro and outro music for our show is a song called Floodlight by Eleanor's former band, Rooftop Revolutionaries. Thanks for listening, and now let's go rattle thrones and topple empires.